Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff.
Yeah.
America's wars.
Yeah.
But not just the ones with, like, the bombs and the bullets and all that. We're talking about the wars at home, too.
Right.
The war on crime, the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And how those are way more connected to what America's been doing overseas than a lot of people realize.
Yeah. You handed us a quite a hefty book here.
It is a big one.
Osamah Khalil's new book, A World of Enemies.
Yes.
And this thing is a whirlwind.
It is.
It goes through history. It makes all these connections between Vietnam, the war on terror, everything in between, and basically argues that America has gotten into this pattern, this habit of trying to manage instability around the world.
And usually with a lot of guns and bombs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Khalil doesn't just lay out this history. He actually asks whether this constant intervention actually works.
Right.
What's the cost of always trying to play world police? And is it actually making things better? Or just creating more chaos?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And Khalil really digs into how the legacy of Vietnam, particularly that fear of another loss, like that shaped American foreign policy for decades.
So it's like a Vietnam hangover that the U.S. just couldn't shake.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every intervention, whether it's Cambodia, Nicaragua, even places like Bolivia, Angola, all those decisions were made with this ghost of Vietnam kind of looming in the background.
And that fear led to some really messed up stuff.
Yeah.
Like literally inflating enemy body counts in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Just to make it look like America was tougher.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Manipulating numbers like that, it's disturbing.
It's a chilling example of how focusing on the wrong things to measure can warp everything.
Yeah.
They were so obsessed with body counts in Vietnam that it actually encouraged violence against civilians, just to make the numbers look better.
Just to hit their quotas, essentially.
Yeah, and tragically, this wasn't just limited to Vietnam. This kind of distorted report, this need to show progress no matter what, it popped up again and again later on in other conflicts.
Makes you wonder about the information we're getting today.
Right.
Like, what numbers are they giving us versus what's actually happening?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got to always be critical of those narratives that we're being given.
Mm-hmm.
But switching gears for a sec.
Yeah.
We were talking about that classic film, The Battle of Algiers, a while back.
Yeah, fantastic film.
Khalil points out that back in the 60s, Americans saw this parallel between that film, which is about, fighting colonialism and both the Vietnam War and the social unrest that was happening back here in the U.S.
Wow.
It's fascinating how one piece of pop culture could speak to those different but kind of related struggles.
Yeah, it's like people were recognizing the same patterns of power and resistance, but in totally different contexts.
Exactly, and that's something that we still see today, right?
Yeah.
Think about shows like 24 or The West Wing and how those have really shaped how we understand terrorism or political maneuvering.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got this Vietnam hangover that's shaping foreign policy.
Right.
But then at the same time, you've got this whole other thing blowing up back home.
Yeah.
The wars on crime and drugs.
Right.
So how does that fit into all of this?
Well, this is where Khalil's book gets really interesting.
Okay.
He argues that these weren't just domestic issues. They were actually intertwined with America's actions overseas in ways that you wouldn't expect.
Okay. How so?
Well, take the Nixon Doctrine, for example.
Nixon's big idea to reduce America's involvement in the world after Vietnam.
That's the one. But the question is, did this hands-off approach really make things more peaceful?
Okay.
He looks at examples from Jordan and Chile.
Okay.
And it gets complicated because on the one hand, you have this idea of letting other countries sort out their own problems.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, was America just creating a vacuum for more chaos?
Right. So where did the wars on crime and drugs fit into all this? It seems like a totally different battlefield.
That's what's so insightful about Khalil's analysis.
Okay.
So while Nixon was pulling back in some places, he was actually ramping up the war on drugs back home.
Okay.
And this wasn't just about cracking down on crime, it was a calculated political move.
You're saying Nixon used the war on drugs to basically increase his own power.
Absolutely. When Nixon was running for president, his team knew that tackling crime was going to be key for him to succeed. They even had strategy sessions about what types of crime to focus on once he got into office.
And they landed on drugs.
Exactly. And it's fascinating why, see, street crime like robbery or assault, that's usually handled by local police.
Right.
Drugs, on the other hand, especially anything crossing state lines that fell under federal jurisdiction.
Okay, so by focusing on drugs, Nixon could exert more control.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about morality or being tough on crime. It was about consolidating power.
Exactly. And of course, the war on drugs played perfectly into the anxieties of that time. It allowed Nixon to tap into this fear of the other.
Which back then meant?
Black communities, the counterculture anti-war protesters, basically anyone who didn't fit into his image of the silent majority.
It's amazing how much context matters here.
Yeah.
Things that seem totally separate, like Vietnam, the war on drugs.
Right.
They're all part of this bigger story about America trying to figure out its place in the world.
Exactly. And those narratives about American power, about decline, about who the enemy is,
Right.
those continue to shape U.S. foreign policy even today.
Which brings us to the rise of global terrorism. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Khalil argues that the seeds of modern terrorism were actually sown way back in the 1960s.
Wow, okay.
He points to the rise of groups like the PLO as a key turning point.
The PLO that far back. That was during the Cold War, right?
Exactly. And this is where that idea of unintended consequences comes back in.
Okay.
Khalil argues that American policies during the Cold War, which were often aimed at fighting communism, sometimes actually ended up helping the very groups that would later become America's enemies.
You're saying we accidentally helped create the monster?
It's more complex than that, of course.
Okay.
But Khalil makes this really compelling case that by being so focused on one enemy, the Soviet Union, America often ignored other threats and even empowered groups that they later regret.
Wow. So we're already seeing these connections between the Cold War, Vietnam, and the rise of terrorism.
Yeah.
But then things really heat up in the 80s with Reagan.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how Reagan, much like Nixon, came into office during a time when America was feeling really insecure about its place in the world.
Right.
And just like Nixon, Reagan used that fear, that narrative of decline to justify taking a more aggressive stance both at home and abroad.
And Reagan was not shy about using force.
Not at all.
Whether it was cracking down on drugs in the U.S. or intervening in conflicts overseas.
Remember, this was the era of the crack epidemic,
Right.
which, let's be honest, was often used to justify racist policies that really targeted communities of color. And on the foreign policy side, you've got the Contras in Nicaragua, the intervention in Lebanon, the whole Iran-Contra affair.
It's a lot.
Reagan was all about projecting American power.
Yeah.
Even if it meant bending the rules a little bit.
It's like this constant push and pull.
Right.
Wanting to be the world's policeman, but also not wanting to get stuck in another Vietnam.
Exactly. And this tension was only made worse by the rise of groups like Hezbollah and the escalating conflict in the Middle East.
So it's like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And then just as things couldn't get any more complicated, the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses, boom,
Right.
Cold War's over.
Right.
You think that would simplify things?
You'd think so, right.
Yeah.
But Khalil actually points out that the end of the Cold War didn't exactly usher in an era of peace and stability.
Oh, no.
If anything, it created a whole new set of uncertainties and challenges that American foreign policy really struggled to deal with.
Kind of a victory parade, no, like, mission accomplished banner or anything.
Not exactly. Instead of having a clear enemy and a clear path forward,
Right.
the U.S. was kind of in this weird, uncertain place.
Yeah.
It's like, if you can imagine, the map got totally redrawn,
Okay.
but nobody told America where anything was.
And that makes these connections Khalil draws between America's wars abroad and the ones at home
Yeah.
even more unsettling, right?
Right.
Because if the old rules don't apply anymore, do you just, like, make up new ones as you go?
That's kind of what it seems like happened.
Yeah.
Take the first Gulf War, for example.
Okay.
On the surface, it was a decisive win for the U.S., right?
Right.
But it also marked the beginning of this long-term military presence in the Middle East.
Right.
Which, spoiler alert, has had some pretty big ripple effects.
Yeah, and this is where this whole war on terror narrative starts to emerge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1990s, you see groups like Al-Qaeda appear, and the U.S. trying to figure out how to fight this totally new kind of enemy. But the tools they were using, things like sanctions, covert ops, that was all stuff developed during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah.
Even stuff they used in the fight against drugs.
So they took this, like, toolbox designed for a totally different job and just hoped for the best.
It's more than that. Khalil argues that there was this underlying belief that the ways America used its power were fine.
Okay.
They just needed a new target.
Okay, so new enemy, same playbook.
Basically. And that takes us to the Clinton years.
Right.
Remember engagement and enlargement.
Remind me what that was.
So that was Clinton's big foreign policy vision.
Okay.
Promoting democracy and free trade all around the world.
Sounds good on paper.
Right. But at the same time, you have his administration escalating the war on drugs, particularly in Latin America. And we also see military interventions in Somalia, the Balkans.
So it's not just Republicans. It's not just Reagan.
Right.
This whole idea that America fixes things with force. That was both parties.
100%. And that's one of Khalil's most thought-provoking points.
Okay.
These wars, both the ones at home and the ones overseas, they're driven by this really deep-seated set of beliefs and practices.
Okay.
And it almost doesn't matter who's in charge.
It's like this political echo chamber, except instead of sound, it's just explosions.
Right.
I don't know, that metaphor got away from me, but you see what I mean, right?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's what makes Khalil's book so important. He's not just listing a bunch of events.
Right.
He's actually uncovering these patterns in how America thinks.
Okay, so can we talk about drone warfare?
Sure.
That feels like a whole other chapter in this story.
It's a big one. And it really takes off during the Obama years.
Okay.
Suddenly you've got this technology that lets you kill people from so far away, no boots on the ground, no risk to American soldiers.
Yeah, which might sound like a good thing on the surface,
Right.
less risk, but
Right.
it feels like that opens up a whole other can of worms.
You've hit on a key issue: ethics. When you take away that immediate risk of sending soldiers into harm's way,
Yeah.
does it make it too easy to use lethal force?
Right. Are we making decisions we wouldn't otherwise make because it feels less risky?
Exactly. And Khalil really wants us to think about those questions.
So how does that play out? What happens when you have these new tools but the old mindset?
Well, he goes into the Obama administration's use of something called a disposition matrix.
Okay, disposition matrix sounds intense. What is that?
So imagine a spreadsheet, literally a spreadsheet,
Okay.
that lists individuals
Okay.
and the criteria for whether or not the U.S. can target them for assassination,
Wow.
potentially with a drone strike.
Wow.
This raises some serious questions about due process.
Yeah, go to the rules even.
Exactly. What happens to the rules of war when you're fighting something like terror,
Right.
which doesn't have a defined battlefield or a clear enemy?
And then doesn't that ambiguity bleed back home too?
Exactly.
Or we're talking increased surveillance, the erosion of privacy.
Exactly. And that's where Khalil connects this back to the war on drugs.
Okay.
He has a whole chapter on Plan Colombia.
Plan Colombia, wasn't that where the U.S. sent billions of dollars to help Colombia fight drug traffickers?
That's the one. And Khalil's point isn't about whether that money was good or bad.
Okay.
It's that it had all these unintended consequences.
Like what?
Human rights abuses, environmental damage.
Right.
And even after all that investment, did it even work?
I'm sensing a no coming.
You're right. The results were mixed at best.
Okay.
And what's even more interesting is how Plan Colombia is kind of a mirror for what was happening in Afghanistan at the same time.
Okay.
Both were these huge efforts to try to stabilize struggling countries.
Right.
But both got really messy. Both were way more costly than anyone expected.
Yeah.
And both ended up entangling the U.S. in these local conflicts.
Which is exactly what we supposedly didn't want after Vietnam.
Exactly. It's like the U.S. keeps trying to play whack-a-mole with global instability.
I love that analogy.
But every time they whack one mole, two more pop up.
Right.
And that's why understanding the historical context that Khalil lays out is so crucial.
Yeah.
It helps us see the patterns, the things that stay the same, even when the specifics change.
Okay, so to recap, we've got Vietnam, the war on drugs, terrorism, drones, Plan Colombia.
Right.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Is there one big takeaway from Khalil's book that you think our listeners should really hold on to?
I think the one thread that runs through all of it is the narrative of decline.
What do you mean by that?
So this idea that America's power in the world is fading,
Okay.
that we're losing influence, losing ground.
Okay.
And this fear, this narrative has been used by presidents from both parties
Both sides of the aisle.
to justify being more aggressive in the world.
Because if America's not the top dog anymore,
Yeah.
the only way to stay on top is by bullying everyone else.
That's often the logic, but Khalil makes you question if it's even true.
Is America actually declining?
Right. Or is that just a convenient story that politicians tell to justify throwing their weight around? And here's the kicker. Khalil argues that this fear of decline has actually often led to policies that made things less stable.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. You're so scared of losing power that you end up making decisions that make you weaker.
Wow.
And that's the trap that Khalil wants us to see and hopefully avoid.
Yeah.
Because if we just keep acting out of fear, out of this need to constantly prove ourselves,
Right.
we're probably just going to keep making the same mistakes.
Okay, so we've got this fear of decline, this addiction to military solutions, this blurring of lines between what's happening at home and abroad.
Yeah.
Where does that leave us? What's Khalil's final word on America's place in the world today?
He doesn't really give us easy answers,
Okay.
but he gives us a lot to think about. His main argument is that America has been trying to control global instability for decades,
Right.
mostly through force.
Yeah.
And the results have been, at best, a mixed bag.
Meaning, sometimes it works, sometimes it blows up in our faces.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just creates new problems we never even saw coming.
That's a pretty good summary. So the big question is, what's the alternative?
Right.
What should America's role be in this messy, complicated world?
Does he give us an answer? Like a step-by-step plan for a new foreign policy?
He doesn't. He's more interested in helping us find the answers ourselves.
Okay.
He gives us the historical context, the critical analysis, but he leaves the conclusions to us.
Because he's giving us the tools to think for ourselves.
Exactly. But he is definitely skeptical of this forever war mindset that's been so dominant in U.S. foreign policy.
This idea that America always has to be on guard, always ready to fight, that we're surrounded by enemies.
Exactly. Khalil seems to be suggesting a different path, one that's less about force and more about diplomacy,
Okay.
about really understanding other cultures and other conflicts.
So less about forcing our will on the world and more about listening and working together.
That's the idea. But what that actually looks like in practice, well, that's something we all need to figure out.
It's almost like Khalil wrote this entire book as one giant provocative closing thought,
Right.
which is impressive. But did he give us anything specific to chew on?
He did. Remember how we were talking about that gap between rhetoric and reality in U.S. foreign policy?
How can I forget? It's basically the story of American politics.
Right. But he draws this really stark contrast with Bush's vision for Palestine.
Right, this whole little flower of democracy thing.
Exactly. While at the same time he was launching the Iraq War.
Yeah, it's a pretty big disconnect.
It is. And Khalil's point is that this gap between what we say we want in the world
Right.
and what we actually do has actually been growing wider.
Okay.
And he thinks this is especially true when it comes to the war on terror.
You mean how we talk about fighting terrorism,
Yeah.
but our methods often just make things worse?
More than that, even. He argues that we've become so focused on fighting terrorism,
Okay.
on getting rid of every single threat,
Yeah.
that we've totally lost sight of the bigger picture.
We're so busy putting out fires that we're not thinking about how to prevent them in the first place.
Exactly. We're so busy fighting the last war, or even the current one,
Right.
that we're not thinking about what comes after.
What happens after you defeat ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whoever the enemy is this week?
Right.
What happens after you take out the target with the drone strike?
What's the end game?
Yeah.
And is this endless pursuit of security actually making us less safe in the long run?
Wow.
Those are the questions he leaves us with.
And they're not easy questions to answer.
Not at all.
Man, my brain is full.
Mine too. It's been quite a journey.
It has. It's like we just ran a marathon through history, except with a lot more explosions.
A very intense marathon.
Okay, so Khalil leaves us with this image of America kind of lost in the woods, chasing shadows,
Yeah.
and maybe even making the woods darker in the process.
It's a powerful image.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There have to be some glimmers of hope.
There are. And Khalil doesn't ignore those. He actually points to several times when the U.S. has managed to step back from the brink and try a different approach, something less about military force and more about diplomacy.
Like what? Give me an example.
We'll take the Obama administration's efforts to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran.
Okay.
That was a huge gamble,
It was.
and it faced a lot of opposition both in the U.S. and abroad.
Right.
But it showed that it's actually possible to resolve really difficult conflicts through diplomacy instead of violence.
And it worked for a while,
It did.
until Trump came along and scrapped the whole thing.
Speaking of Trump, how does Khalil handle his presidency?
It's interesting. He doesn't hold back at all.
Okay.
He describes Trump's foreign policy as erratic, impulsive, and often driven more by Trump's own personal grudges
Yeah.
than any kind of strategy.
Which honestly sounds about right.
Yeah. But how does Trump fit into this bigger story that Khalil's telling?
That's a great question.
I think Khalil argues that Trump was both a symptom of these larger trends and something that made those trends even worse.
Okay, so how so?
Well, on the one hand, Trump's America First approach,
was really just this extreme version of that narrative of decline that we were talking about.
Like that America's been taken advantage of.
Exactly. It was this idea that America had been getting a raw deal from the rest of the world.
Right.
And that it was time to focus on ourselves.
And that really resonated with a lot of people.
It did. And that's where the making things worse part comes in.
Okay.
Trump really tapped into this deep vein of resentment and anxiety
About
America's place in the world,
okay.
but also about things changing here at home.
Yeah.
Anxieties about demographics, about culture.
Right, the whole Make America Great Again thing.
Exactly. And that message really connected with people who felt like they'd been left behind.
By globalization, by the economy.
Exactly. They felt forgotten.
So Trump took these existing trends, this fear, this turning inward,
Right.
and just turned them up to 11.
Basically. And that had a huge impact on U.S. foreign policy. We saw the U.S. pull back from international agreements.
Right.
We saw this disregard for traditional alliances.
Right.
And this much more confrontational approach to countries like China and Iran.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't afraid to pick a fight.
Not at all.
It's like he was trying to undo decades of U.S. foreign policy in just 4 years.
In some ways he was. But Khalil also says that even Trump couldn't totally escape the patterns of the past.
Meaning?
Well, even though Trump talked a big game about ending the forever wars,
Okay.
he actually continued a lot of the same policies as the presidents before him.
Like what?
Things like drone strikes, military interventions.
So it was more like a change in style than substance.
In many ways, yes.
No.
Which brings us to today. What does Khalil's book tell us about the future of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, if I had to guess, I'd say it's not looking too good.
It's not the most optimistic outlook. Khalil doesn't offer any easy solutions or happy predictions.
Okay.
But he does give us a few really important takeaways.
Like what?
Well, first, he says that the U.S. is at a crossroads.
Okay.
We can either keep going down the same path we've been on.
This path of endless war.
Exactly. Or we can choose a different direction.
What would that look like?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Khalil doesn't give us a detailed roadmap,
Okay.
but he suggests that it would have to involve a much more thoughtful approach to foreign policy.
Okay.
One that recognizes that America isn't all-powerful
No.
and that sometimes the best solutions come from diplomacy and working with other countries.
So less about telling everyone else what to do
Yeah,
and more about listening and cooperating.
exactly.
That's a pretty big shift.
It is. And he also emphasizes how important it is to deal with the problems here in the U.S.
Okay.
The things that are feeding into these wars, both at home and abroad.
Things like what?
Things like racial injustice,
Right.
economic inequality, the fact that our police are becoming more and more militarized.
Because those things don't just happen in a vacuum, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They shape our foreign policy just as much as our foreign policy shapes them.
So it's not enough to just be smarter in how we deal with the rest of the world. We have to actually become a more fair and just society ourselves.
That's the challenge Khalil puts forward. And it's a big one.
It is.
But it's also incredibly hopeful.
How so?
Because it suggests that we actually have the power to change.
To change ourselves.
Not just our foreign policy, but also ourselves. And ultimately, isn't that the only way to create a truly just and peaceful world?
That's a powerful thought. That's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's one of those books that makes you think differently about everything.
It does. Big thanks to Osamah Khalil for writing such a thought-provoking book.
Absolutely.
And to you, dear listener, for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you for listening.
Remember, keep asking questions, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive. So if America really wants to break out of this cycle of war and intervention, what needs to change? It feels like Khalil's pushing for more than just like tweaking a few policies.
Yeah, you're right on the money with that. It's not just about like swapping out a policy here or there.
Okay.
Khalil's arguing for something way bigger, like a fundamental shift in how America looks at itself and its place in the world.
So like ditching this whole America as world police thing.
It's even bigger than that. It's about really questioning the assumptions underneath that whole idea.
Okay, like what?
This idea that America has all the answers,
Right.
that we know what's best for everybody else,
Right.
that military force can solve any problem.
Which is honestly a pretty arrogant way to think.
It is, and I think that's part of Khalil's point. He's not saying America should just like disappear from the world stage or that we haven't done some good things.
Right.
But he's saying we need to be a lot humbler
Okay.
way more aware of the limits of our power,
Okay.
and way more aware of how our actions can have unintended consequences.
So less might makes right, and more like listening and actually working with other countries.
Exactly. And not just working with other countries, but really listening to the people in those countries.
Okay.
Understanding their perspectives, their needs, what they want.
Because this whole, like, imposing democracy thing hasn't really panned out, has it?
Not so much. And that gets back to those unintended consequences. We
Right.
go in with these big plans, good intentions.
Right.
But we often end up making things a lot worse. And Khalil's book has a lot of examples of that.
And it feels like those unintended consequences always seem to hit the people who are already struggling the hardest.
100%, both
Yeah.
here in the US and abroad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why Khalil says it's so important to deal with those problems here at home.
Right.
Things like racial injustice, economic inequality, even the way our police are becoming so militarized.
It's all connected.
Because those things don't just happen in isolation.
Absolutely not. They shape our foreign policy just as much as our foreign policy shapes them.
It's like this vicious cycle.
It is. And Khalil's saying that until we confront those big systemic issues here in the US,
Right.
we're probably going to keep repeating the same mistakes out in the world.
So it's not enough to just be like smarter in how we engage with the world.
Right.
We actually have to become a more just and equal society ourselves.
That's the real challenge here. And it's not easy, but it's also incredibly hopeful.
How so?
Because it means we have the power to change. We can change not just our foreign policy, but also ourselves.
Wow. And ultimately, isn't that the only way to really build a just and peaceful world?
That's what this book made me think about. It's a call to action. It reminds us that we're not just watching history happen.
Right.
We're a part of it. And the choices we make right now will determine what kind of world we leave behind.
Man, that's a powerful thought. This has been an intense deep dive.
It has, but so worth it. It's one of those books that really sticks with you.
It does. It really makes you see everything differently. Big thanks to Osamah Khalil for writing it,
Absolutely.
and to you, dear listener, for being here with us.
Thanks for listening.
Remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
It's